All right, party people. So here we go. We're going to go through this. And I'm going to run through the strategies I gave you on the last one as we progress into the June 2019 reading section, part one, passage A. So again, you're looking at what is the setting, conflicts, the emerging themes, main ideas, whatever they ask you, however they ask you. How are those main ideas, central ideas developed in relationships between characters, literary terms, figurative language, and how the different details you get develop either A, what the character is like, or B, what the point of the story is. Okay? So again, with this one, sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. You better hope it does when you get to take it. But again, looking at the final page tells me Arthur C. Clarke from a text called Expedition to Earth tells me a lot about the setting, adapted from a text called If I Forget Thee, O Earth. So that took me 4 seconds to figure out that the setting of this is not Earth, that this is something about a character who is a crisis of setting, like they're dreaming about the Earth or they're thinking about going to Earth. So that's the foreknowledge I get going into this. So I've got my timer here. See it, 0, 0. We're thinking within the 8-minute time frame. I'm going to read this, and using the rules that I've just set out, I'm going to try to annotate just to show you how this process might work. This is an experiment. I remember grading this, but I don't remember so much reading this this text. So here we go. I'm starting the timer. Here we go. When Marvin was 10 years old, his father took him through the long, echoing corridors that led up through the administration and power. So right off the bat, we got this dude Marvin, right, and his dad, right? That's important. Until at last they came to the uppermost level of all and were among the swiftly growing vegetation of the farmlands. So we're establishing setting. So his father is taking him up through some kind of complex, and they're looking over the farmlands, which is weird because it's capitalized. Marvin liked it here. It was fun watching the great slender plants creeping with almost visible eagerness towards the sunlight as it filtered down through the plastic domes to meet them. Again, establishing setting. Characterization 2, this kid is fascinated with this process of the plants growing under these domes and watching it happen. Very science fiction-y. The smell of life was everywhere. There's imagery there, right? The smell, anything that you taste, feel, touch, hear, is imagery. The smell of life was everywhere, awakening inexpressible longings in his heart. Longings in his heart. If you're longing for something, it means you want something, to desire it. No longer was he breathing the dry, cool air of the residential levels, purged of all smells, but the faint tang of ozone. He wished he could stay here for a little while, but father would not let him. So his father seems to be kind of strict. His father must have some kind of important job to let him go through and see all this stuff. They went onwards until they had reached the entrance of the observatory, which he had never visited, but they did not stop, and Marvin knew with a sense of rising excitement that there could be only one goal left. For the first time in his life, he was going outside. And outside there, if you're following along at home, is capitalized. So where is he going? He's leaving this tower and going, quote, outside. It's a big deal. There were a dozen of the surface vehicles with their wide balloon tires and pressurized cabins. Why would it be pressurized? I don't know. I'm starting to think maybe this is like the moon or something. His father must have been expected, for they were led at once to the little scout car waiting by the huge circular door of the airlock. Tense with expectancy, Marvin settled himself down in the cramped cabin while his father started the motor and checked the controls. The inner door of the lock slid open and then closed behind them. He heard, imagery, the roar of the great air pumps fade slowly away as the pressure dropped to 0. Then the vacuum sign flashed on. The outer door parted, and before Marvin lay the land which he had never yet entered. He had seen it in photographs, of course. He had watched it and imagined it on television screens 100 times. But now it was lying all around him, burning beneath the fierce sun that crawled so slowly across the jet black sky. There's some imagery for you. He stared into the west, away from the blinding splendor of the sun, and there were the stars, as he had been told but had never quite believed. He gazed at them for a long time, marveling that anything could be bright and so tiny. They were intense, unscintillating points, and suddenly he remembered a rhyme that he had once read in one of his father's books. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. So now we have this character who is experiencing all these images for the first time, thanks to his father. He's remembering things from his childhood. Well, he knew what the stars were. Whoever asked the question must have been very stupid. And what did they mean by twinkle? You could see at a glance that all the stars shone with the same steady, unwavering light. He abandoned the puzzle and turned his attention to the landscape around him. They were racing across a level plain at almost 100 miles an hour, the great balloon tires sending up little spurts of dust behind them. There was no sign of the colony. In the few minutes while he had been gazing at the stars, its domes and radio towers had fallen below the horizon, yet there were other indications of man's presence. For about a mile ahead, Marvin could see the curiously shaped structures clustering around the head of a mine. Now they had now and then a puff of vapor would emerge from a squat smokestack that would instantly disperse. So he's speeding across this landscape. Again, that's setting. They were just past the mine in a moment. Father was driving with a reckless and exhilarating skill, as if it was a strange thought to come into a child's mind. He was trying to escape from something. In a few minutes they had reached the edge of the plateau on which the colony had been built. Again, colony is capitalized. The ground fell sharply away beneath them in a dizzying slope whose lower stretches were lost in shadow. There's a lot of imagery here. Ahead, as far as the eye could reach, was a jumbled wasteland of craters, mountains, ranges, and ravines. The crests of the mountains, catching the low sun, burned like islands of fire in a sea of darkness, and above them the stars still shone as steadfastly as ever. Just thinking here now, the idea of how setting defines us and how nature thrills us. These are central ideas. These are emerging ideas that this kid is just startled with the brilliance of the imagery of the landscape that he's seeing after being in this, what seems to be like this closeted residential area. And now the right was wrinkled, dusty plain, and on the left its ramparts and terraces rising mile after mile into the sky, and a wall of mountains that marched into the distance until its peak sank from sight below the rim of the world. There were no sign that man had ever explored this land, but once they passed the skeleton of a crashed rocket, and beside it a stone cairn, and there's a footnote for that, surmounted by a metal cross. The sun was now low behind the hills on the right, and the valley before them could be in a total darkness, yet it was awash with a cold white radiance that came spilling over the crags beneath which they were driving. Then suddenly they were out in the open plain, and a source of light before them in all its glory. It was very quiet in the little cabin now that the motors had stopped, and only sound was the faint whisper of oxygen feed and an occasional metallic crepitation, which has a footnote, I don't even know that word, as the outer walls of the vehicle radiated away from the heat. For no warmth at all came from the great silver crescent that floated low above the far horizon and flooded all this land with pearly light. It was so brilliant that minutes before Marvin could accept its challenge and look steadfastly into its glare, but at last he could discern the outlines of the continents, the hazy border of the atmosphere, the white islands of clouds, and even in the distance he could see the glitter of sunlight in the polar ice. And what is he looking at? He seems to be looking at something very familiar to us. It was beautiful, and it was called to his heart across the abyss of space. There in the shining crescent were all the wonders that had ever been known, the hues in sunset skies, the moaning of the seas on pebbled shores, the patter of falling rain, the unhurried benison of the snow. These and 1,000 others should have been in his rightful heritage, but he knew them only from the books and ancient records, and the thought filled him with the anguish of exile. Why could they not return? It seemed so peaceful beneath these lines of marching cloud. Then Marvin, his eyes no longer blinded by the glare, saw the portion of the disk that should have been in darkness was gleaming faintly with an evil phosphorescence. And he remembered he was looking upon the funeral pyre of a world, upon the radioactive aftermath of Armageddon. Armageddon. Across a quarter of a mile of millions of miles of space, the glow of dying atoms was still visible, a perennial reminder of the ruined past. It would be centuries, yet before the deadly glow died from the rocks of life could return again to fill the silent, empty world. So at last Marvin understood the purpose of the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage is an important word. He, his father, would never walk beside the rivers of that lost and legendary world, or listen to the thunder raging above its softly rounded hills. Yet one day, how far ahead, his children's children would return and claim their heritage. The winds and the rains would scour the poisons from the burning land and carry them to sea. And in the depths of the sea they would waste their venom until they could harm no living things. Then the great ships that were still waiting here on the silent, dusty plains could lift once more into space along the road that led to home. So, as you can see, that was about a minute more. We're about 9 minutes. That's okay, right? This is a longer text. You know, when I say 8 minutes, that's average. This took us a little bit more than that, about a minute more. But what I would say is that I did stop and I did make comments and think about the setting and think about the characters and their relationships, and I talked about the imagery and the development of the idea of being, blinded by the brilliance of one's environment. There are some other emerging ideas that happen here, thinking about, how we always long for that next big thing. He's talking about at the end there that his children might long to see it again. There's a reveal about how, he's looking at what is the earth that has been destroyed, that has been annihilated through what seems to be some kind of atomic warfare. And I would say that the end of the first 75% of this is a pretty quick read. I stopped a bunch because I just wanted you guys to see that, but there's a lot of big words at the end. So this is challenging a little bit. This is also longer than most texts. Usually it's about 2 pages. This is about 2 pages in a paragraph. So be on the lookout for that. So read through this, annotate it. I'm going to upload the quiz for us for the first 8 questions. I believe it's 8 questions. Answer them honestly. Like I told you in the first video, they're there. You don't need to. The answers are there. But what does that help anybody? So be honest. So when I put this survey up for you, be honest. All right. Cheers, and I'll see you in the next video.